Hi all, and welcome to part 2 of our Automated Guidelines for Healthcare Reimbursement webinar series. I'm Jonathan from Trisotech, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Once again, I'm joined by Denis Gagné, our CEO, and John Svibberly, our CMIO, who will be our presenters. Thank you for tuning back in. We hope that you enjoyed part 1 of the series and that you're keen to go even a bit deeper into the topic. By the way, if you missed part 1, which was a pre-authorization example for an orthopedic surgery, you can always watch it or rewatch it on our website in the webinar section. So as I mentioned, today is part 2 and part 3 will be November 18. So make sure to register for the last presentation of the series so you don't miss out on anything. Before starting, let's go over the usual logistics information. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send you links to the recording as well as the slides, as always. And also, we are saving the last 10 minutes for answering your questions, so please make sure to send them using the GoToWebinar questions panel. Without any further ado, gentlemen, let's get started.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. I'm Denis Gagné, and I'm here with John Svibberly. This series of webinar is on the topic of healthcare reimbursement. In the last webinar, we did a presentation on automated guideline for orthopedic surgery pre-authorization, and today we're tackling off-label drug authorization. So healthcare reimbursement normally involves a series of processes to determine if a patient has insurance coverage for a specific healthcare service or a specific healthcare good. A service or good without pre-authorization or medical necessity is normally not paid for by the insurance company. So that means a big impact to the patient and also to the provider. In the context of this presentation, we're using the term automatable guideline to refer to a single knowledge artifact or visual knowledge artifact that is both human readable and machine automatable. Our objective in using these automatable guidelines is to disintegrate the traditional narrative guidelines that are prone to many interpretations. Our goal is also to provide this knowledge at the right time during the flow of care. So these pre-authorization guidelines have many benefits for the various stakeholders that are involved. In particular, for the payers, it allows for the complete and correct information at submission. It allows to increase the decision throughput and provides a lot of savings in times and money, plus the ability to do a reallocation of the resources. So many different benefits to the different stakeholders can be obtained. The solution provided here or proposed here are marrying two sets of standards. One set of standards from the object management group, namely BPMN, DMN, and CMMN, and a set of standards from the HL7 standard group, namely FHIR and CDS Hook. These are the standards that we're using with this series of webinar, and we'll talk a little bit more about them as we progress. We're also following the guidance of the BPM Plus Health community. The BPM Plus Health community is a community of practice that brings together healthcare institutions, professional societies, and vendors together to foster the best practice in using these standards combined together to provide those solutions that are both human readable and machine automatable. Just to give you a quick intro to the set of standards from the object management standard group, we have the BPMN, CMMN, and DMN. Each of the standard name has this MN kind of moniker. The M refers to model, and that what provides us with the machine interpretable. And the N refers to the unambiguous graphical notation that can be provided by these standards. So the BPMN standard is really about business process, and it provides you process diagrams, so a sequence of activity, and is prescriptive in nature. That is, that it will tell you what should happen in what order. We then also have the case management model and notation. And the case management model and notation is more about unstructured process. It's more about managing a context and the different events that can happen during that context. And the CMMN language is more declarative in nature, so it basically is a series of event, condition, action type of statement that allows you to react in a more ad hoc and undefined way, for example, in terms of doing personalized patient care. And finally, DMN is the decision model annotation. And DMN is really about making decision. And we say in a stateless way, so I'm referring maybe more to the technical people here. That is a one exchange. I provide you with the input and I get the decision back. And it takes, for example, decision table and various logical expression that can be captured. All three of these standards have a couple of things in common. They're both human readable and machine interpretable. They are very visual and simple to understand by subject matter expert. And more importantly, this is really a drawing that you can execute. It is the code. So the drawing is the code itself. So here's a little bit of a quick overview of BPMN to give you a sense of what these visual notations are. In BPMN, a circle means an event. So whenever you see a circle, it's an event. A thin circle is a start event. A thick circle is an end event. And a double line circle is an intermediate event that is an event that happens between the start and the end. And so if we read through this, we have a trigger event that starts this automatable guideline. We then do a task or an activity that needs to be completed. Here, it's an external service that is called. The arrow shows us what should come next. So for example, here we're calling an AI model or machine learning model using the PMML standards. We then move on to another task here, which is calling to obtain a clinical measure. And this particular clinical measure is done using the CQL standard from HL7. And then we move on to another task, which the table here means it's a decision task or rule task. We're using the DMN standard to capture that. And based on the data we have, we get to a gateway. The diamond shape here is a gateway. And the gateway is used to visualize the basically the branching logic. So here with the X, it means it's an exclusive branch. So either one of the two branches here will be taken. We also have a case task here, which is basically a CMMN task that is called. Here we're showing where an external participant is interacting with this process, this automatable guideline, by sending a message that is caught here. Clear symbols here, like the envelope, means that we're catching. Dark symbol would be throwing. And then we end into one of the different end state or outcomes of the automation. We also have the notion of information required as input here. So we see that this data object, this information, is provided as an input to this sub-process. The plus here means that this activity is really a compounded activity that's hiding more details. By pressing on the plus, I can get to the detail. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of what BPMN is. Again, very highly visual way of defining how things should happen in the order. This here is very abstract. It was just to showcase what's possible. And I'll pass it now down to John for him to take us through on the off-label drug portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Danny. Today, for a demo, we're going to be talking about targeted drug therapy. And for you who are not familiar with targeted drugs, they're basically a revolutionary development that's occurred recently, where clones of malignant plasma cells from various animals, such as mice, goats, rabbits, are cultured. And then the antibodies are harvested. The antibodies are then partially treated, and then human proteins are attached so that they become humanized and the immune system is tolerant of them, so you don't get an immune reaction to them as soon as possible. These target a variety of various proteins and have revolutionized rheumatology and oncology, treating diseases that really were not well treated before. And some features of them is that they're relatively expensive, and another is that it's constantly changing with new products coming out all the time. Next slide, please. And here's two examples of targeted therapy. One is rituximab, known as Rituxan, which targets the CD20 protein on the surface of B-cell lymphocytes. When this binds, the cell becomes attractive to host defenses, and the B cells are removed, and as a result, antibody production is reduced, or malignant B cells are removed. And this costs list price at least around $30,000 a year. Pembrolizumab, or known as Keytruda, is a drug that is used to circumvent a event that occurs by many tumors, where the tumors secrete a protein that binds to T cell surface receptors, and these turn off the immune system at checkpoints. By adding this drug, that binding is blocked, and so the body's immune system is able to attack cells. This is a much more expensive drug, being over $100,000 a year. Next slide, please. When we look at the requirements for pre-approval given by various payers, they usually list a number of indications. For Rituxan, it's usually 6 to 8 different items are listed, and the criteria are given. And if we could go to the next slide. These requirements are visually represented here, where the whole diagram is off to the left and a subset is on your right, corresponding to the yellow circled area. And basically, this would automate the pre-approval for one of the approved conditions, and the requirements are relatively straightforward. They usually ask, is the person prescribing it an expert, knowledgeable about the use of this drug? Does the person really have the diagnosis? Is the person responding in certain ways? And then based on that, it's either approved or disapproved. But these are relatively straightforward and understandable. Next slide, please. The problem that you come into with targeted therapies is that the number of conditions where the drug is approved is fixed, whereas the number of indications is exploding. And so this means that for many cases, you have to resort to an appeal. And appeals are problematic. It's a source of great unhappiness for clinicians, payers, patients, everyone involved. It causes problems. And some of the issues that come up with the appeal process is the process for appeal between insurers differs. It's expensive, both for clinicians and for the payers, because the payers have to employ clinicians to review the applications, and the clinicians who are working may not be experts in topics such as targeted therapy. And then finally, the approval requests the requester to give copies of evidence justifying its use. And this may be incomplete or biased, so the quality is variable for this. Next slide, please. When we look at the whole idea of what is the evidence for usage, I think that almost all drug companies, if there's evidence that the therapy would be beneficial, would be all for it. However, many of these requests, the evidence isn't all that good. Sometimes there's very little evidence, sometimes the evidence is weak, and sometimes it's early on or spotty. So it's really uncertain if this is going to benefit the patient or not. This pushes the payers into a quandary. Do they outright reject the request because there's no evidence? Is there weak evidence, but there's not enough to justify its approval, and so the patient should be routed towards a clinical trial? Is this something they should actually consider? approving or not. So this places the payers in a bit of a pinch. The next slide, please. When the groups request evidence for efficacy, they usually have a list of journals or resources where they say, okay, you want to do this, give me some papers to justify this use, and they give a list of well-respected resource materials that they ask you to submit along with the appeal. Next slide, please. When the appeal process is mapped out, this is basically what you get, where you start on the left and process to the right. This consists of 4 decisions, all which are DMN models, as indicated by the little hash mark in the top left. The first one says, well, is this drug experimental or research? If it's more experimental or research, then it really should be enrolled in a clinical trial and it's shown off to the first exit. The next question is there an approved therapy that might be cheaper or something that might be a more acceptable therapy? If there is and has been tried, then the person should be tried on that. The third decision is, what's the evidence of efficacy? Is this going to work? And then if there isn't, it's routed out. If there is, then you look for contraindications. And if there are no contraindications, it's approved. If there are contraindications, then it's rejected. When you look at the decisions, the decision about contraindications in alternative therapies are fairly standard and straightforward. 2 areas which are amenable to process automation is one, the enrollment in clinical trials, and the second is evidence for efficacy. When you enroll a person in clinical trials, it often is hands-on search, which is relatively inefficient, and it also causes a lot of people not to be included. One of the goals of clinical trials is to include as many people as possible, including people who might have been otherwise excluded. And so some type of process to improve that would be a high priority. And then we talk about the evidence of efficacy. If we go to the next slide, please. Often the decision is a simple decision table with relatively rudimentary inputs. And it would be desirable to make this more efficient. And we'll get into that to follow the demonstration. Back to you, Denny.
Thank you, John. So we'll just move into a little bit of a demo very quickly here. Let me show you. So basically, here we have a series of models that we have. So this is the on-label model that John presented. So again, a very visual way of doing this, bringing all this together. You can see there's quite a lot of logic to it, but again, very simple to understand what's going on. When we move on to the off-label, again, the same way, we have the sequence, and here's the DMN model of the decision. Again, a very simple decision table where if there is published, we make sure that they're within this list, and if they're not within this list, then we'll refuse the evidence. So what we've done is we've taken this model here and published this model with a one-click publish. So when I press this button, it actually generates a service out of this diagram. And so this service is executable, and I can come here and try this service. So in particular, the Trisotech platform generates all these services on the fly for you. You have nothing else to do. And I can exercise this service via either a REST API or get the open API for it. And here I'm just going to use the form exerciser if you want. And here I can actually exercise the service to see the interaction. And this is mimicking the interaction that's taking place between a service call. So a service call would receive the question to which an answer would be provided. So if I answer no and I go on, so basically I answered no here, it moved me to this step, and then I can see the various status on my thing, which are still running. Then I go to approve alternative. There, approve alternative, then depending on my answer here, so if I say no, it then moves me to establish efficacy. Basically, I've moved down this path of no here, and I'm at this point into the process. And if I carry on like this and say, yes, there is, and there is something from Walter, and I run it, then you can see that I move, and as I progress, the answer to the various questions here that were provided are tallied into my, but I don't have yet the contraindication. So if I move to the contraindication, is there contraindication? And if I say no to both questions here, then I end up in the end state of approved. So basically what I've done is I stepped through here, went down here, went down here, went down here, and finally moved into the approved end state. But many possible outcomes were here. I could have ended in any of these end states. And the service is generic in the sense that one model allows you to finish in any of these end states. So let me go back to our presentation quickly, because one thing we can also do is we've shown here something that is more strict and in its automation, where the establishing the evidence of efficacy is basically based on a simple decision table. What I can do also is inject here some AI, some artificial intelligence, machine learning predictive model, and inject it into that decision. And you can see now that at the top of the decision, I'm basically invoking this efficacy of prediction model, and I'm expecting a quality of the evidence that I'm receiving. And this quality of evidence then will be either according to the OMC categorization, category 1, 2A, etc. And based on whether there is published or non-published, and based on the category of the evidence that was found by the machine learning, I can then augment my decision making. So we wanted to show that not only can you use, some very prescriptive, strict decision, you can also open it up to introduce some predictive model from AI, machine learning into this as well. So in conclusion, we feel that combining these standards from the object management group, what's called the BPM Plus Health Standard Series, with the HL7 standard, we provide a very simple way to automate the confirming of unlabeled drug, but we also offer a way for doing appealing and reviewing of the off-label drug use. We think that this standardization of pre-authorization will reduce the burden of the human review greatly on both sides of the fence. So that was our quick presentation. We intentionally made it very quick and brief, direct to the point, so that we could have some time for some question at the end.
Yes, thank you. So I'm back exactly for the questions. So we still have time. I already received a couple of questions, but if you want to submit some more questions, go ahead. We still have a little bit more than 5 minutes. So the first question here, so when you were in the DMN modeler, you showed some of the rules that are used for the decisions, but we have a question here. Is the same platform could be used to do the maintaining of the medical billing and coding?
Yeah, in essence, you could write. So what we're showing here are processes and decision. So you could write a set of processes that are specifically around the coding, or a set of decisions that are around the coding, whether the coding was adequate or inadequate, and all this. So yes, you could define using these same visual standards, processes and decision related to coding.
And also, codes can be embedded within the data items so that you have no errors of human lookup. All the codes can be applied, as many as needed.
Yes, exactly. So for example, every data or information object that provides information can be coded to either a specific code or a value set to recognize that this is the proper information for that decision.
Makes perfect sense. All right, thank you. So we have another question here. So you said that you guys made this very brief. We have a question. If we can go back to one of the first slides where we were showing the value for all of the stakeholders, the providers and the payers and the patient, and maybe go back to this a little bit because we went very fast. So we have a question about this here.
Okay, so fundamentally here, we just wanted to list some of the benefits. The range of benefits is probably much broader, depending on which type of stakeholder you are. I've mentioned the benefits to the payers, because pre-authorization normally is something that is much more involving the payer organization. From a patient point of view, maybe I'll let John speak to all those points. It's more his expertise.
Well, I guess there's many benefits, but I think when you look at it, there's some benefits that are more than others. From a provider viewpoint, the current system is the information is delayed. A provider makes a request, it goes in, and then sometime later, which could be weeks or months later, you get a response. And as a provider, you no longer remember the case very well. You've also had to deal with a patient who's very anxious, and in the case of oncology, they want to be treated immediately. You can't afford delay. What automation allows you to do is submit the data, and then almost instantaneous, while you're sitting with the patient, you can decide, is this approved or not? And if it's not approved, you know why. And you can start an appeal immediately, which means that everything becomes real time, and there's no delay factor fit in. So I think that means the patient is happier. They know they're going to get treated, and the chances of getting a surprise bill 2 years later is reduced. The physicians get immediate feedback. They know where they need to clean up, and that results in them being more satisfied with the whole process.
Thank you very much. So we have about a minute or so, so let's take one more question. So in the example that we showed, I guess there's a question around the accountability. So would that be the payer that runs the decision? If so, if it's based on the payer's guidelines, so who would kind of be accountable for this decision if it's run on the provider's side?
The question is that this is not an either or. Hopefully this is more collaborative in how things are done. Right now it's kind of like the payers do their thing and the providers do their thing, and no one talks to me. It's very little conversation going on. What you really want is both people talking to each other to streamline the process. The criteria for approval are stated by the payers. So the payers say this is what it is. But if I'm a payer and I set up a process and I'm a clinician who's making the request, I can execute the thing on their side and get feedback from it. So therefore, I'm just a user of a process set up by the payer. So everything would devolve upon the payer. Right. I think one thing that automation means is that there's more accountability, because it's real time, you can start noticing if there are discrepancies that occur, in which case there are means of correcting that. Hopefully what you want to do is have communication so that the patient benefits in the end.
Yeah, and you can imagine many deployment. So for example, you can imagine a deployment where it is the payer that is offering the service of the decision and the process, but you can also imagine a version of it that is on the provider side, on the clinician, where they can quote unquote go test the results before they do the official submission. So they could have the version localized and actually submit that to do some quote unquote validation and testing of what they could and could not submit before they use the official service provided by the payer.
Well, that's a very complete answer. Thank you very much. I guess we reached our 30-minute mark, so I will let you guys go. So to all of you that asks, because we always get some very specific questions and questions that are related to the software itself, so we're going to follow up with you personally. Thank you very much. We'll see each other in 4 weeks for part 3.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you,
All right.
Jonathan. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.